Good morning, afternoon. My name is Jermaine Whiteside, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Liberty University School of Divinity. Today, I'll be presenting Chapter 1 of my Dissertation-in-Praxis project, which focuses on governance implementation at Anointed Connect Church, a single-member digital native faith organization. This chapter establishes the strategic problem that motivates my research and outlines the intervention I'll be implementing to address a critical gap between governance policy and operational practice. Let's begin by examining the organizational context and the specific challenge we're addressing. Anointed Connect Church is a unique organization operating at the intersection of several legal and ecclesial frameworks. First, the organizational structure. The church operates as a single member nonprofit corporation under South Carolina law, Section 331-101 and following. This legal structure permits concentration of governance authority in one individual, the sole director, while still maintaining tax-exempt status under IRS Code Section 501c3. Second, the ministry model. Unlike traditional brick-and-mortar congregations, Anointed Connect is a digital native online church. This means the church has no physical sanctuary, and ministry occurs entirely through digital platforms. Third, the governance framework. In 2024, the organization adopted version 5 bylaws which establish sophisticated governance structures, including an oversight committee, 3-tier succession protocols, and an intellectual property management framework. Here's the central challenge. While these governance structures exist in policy, documented in the bylaws, the organization has never developed operational implementation protocols. In other words, we have the what of governance, but not the how. This gap between policy and practice is what motivates this entire dissertation-in-praxis project. Now, let me define the strategic problem precisely. The problem is not that Anointed Connect organization lacks governance structures. The version 5 bylaws are actually quite sophisticated, establishing an oversight committee, 3-tier succession protocols, and intellectual property frameworks. The problem is the misalignment between this sophisticated policy, what exists in the bylaws, and the complete absence of operational implementation protocols, the documented procedures that would make these structures function in practice. This policy practice gap creates 3 critical consequences. First, delayed decision making. Without documented protocols defining when the oversight committee must be consulted versus when the sole director can act unilaterally, every decision requires deliberation about the decision-making process itself, not just the decision content. Second, inconsistent application of governance provisions. The bylaws establish 3-tier succession protocols and intellectual property licensing requirements, but there are no step-by-step procedures for how these provisions actually work. This creates interpretation dependency rather than procedural certainty. Third, regulatory vulnerability. The IRS requires 501c3 organizations to demonstrate, not just claim, that governance structures ensure accountability and prevent private benefit. Without operational protocols, we cannot show how our governance functions, only that governance provisions exist in policy. From a planning theory perspective, this is what Kettner and colleagues call incomplete program planning at the operational stage. The structures are designed, but implementation mechanisms are absent. The theoretical foundation for this project comes primarily from planning theory, specifically the work of Kettner, Maroney, and Martin in their text, Designing and Managing Programs, an Effectiveness-Based Approach. Planning theory provides the interpretive lens for understanding this implementation gap and guides the development of operational protocols. Kettner's framework is particularly useful because it distinguishes between felt needs, problems recognized by stakeholders, and normative needs, gaps identified through systematic analysis against standards. At Anointed Connect organization, we have both. Leaders recognize operational delays as problems, that's a felt need. Simultaneously, analysis reveals that while governance structures exist, they don't meet IRS demonstration requirements for accountability. That's a normative need. 3, supporting theoretical frameworks inform the intervention. First, stewardship theory from Davis and colleagues. Unlike agency theory, which assumes self interested behavior, stewardship theory recognizes that leaders in faith based organizations often prioritize mission over personal gain. However, even steward oriented leaders benefit from structural accountability. Second, organizational systems theory from Peter Singe's work. This helps us understand how governance structures interact with operational processes to enable or constrain organizational effectiveness. Third, digital ecclesiology from Heidi Campbell's research on religious practice in new media worlds. Online faith communities create authority and legitimacy through different mechanisms than traditional physical congregations, which is directly relevant to our context. Together, these frameworks guide the implementation of governance protocols appropriate for a single member digital native faith organization. Let me show you the sophistication of the governance structures already established in the version 5, 5 bylaws. These are not basic or minimal provisions. They represent thoughtful, comprehensive governance design. First, the oversight committee structure from Article 8, Section 802. The bylaws establish a committee of 3 to 7 members who must be independent and uncompensated. Each member must hold at least a bachelor's degree and possess 10 years of leadership or governance experience. Members must annually certify their independence and freedom from conflicts of interest. Second, the three-tier succession protocols from sections 805 through 808. This is particularly sophisticated. Tier 1 is normal succession through committee vote. Tier 2 is an institutional nomination failsafe, activated when fewer than 2 committee members remain, with Liberty University and the endowment trustee submitting nominees. Tier 3 is emergency reconstitution, activated when no committee members and no sole director remain, using a governance review panel to appoint an interim committee. Third, the intellectual property framework from Article 7. This prevents unintended IP aggregation by clarifying that intellectual property not expressly assigned to the church remains with its owner. All church use of non-owned IP must be governed by written license agreements. The bylaws specifically acknowledge the Whiteside Family Trust as proprietor of certain trademarks used by the church. Fourth, provisions for an online member advisory representative from Section 8. Affirms. This non-voting, advisory-only role allows member input while preserving the single-member corporate structure. The representative serves a one-year term and has no authority over compensation, IP investments, or succession decisions. These structures demonstrate organizational awareness and governance sophistication. The problem is not governance design, it's implementation operationalization. This table documents the implementation gap through a systematic analysis of evidence. First row, Oversight Committee Protocol absence. Article 8 establishes the committee structure and policy, but there is no operational documentation. There are no protocols. Committee members are unclear on basic operational questions. How often do we meet? What requires our approval versus simply our awareness? Who do we report to and how? When must the sole director consult us versus act independently? Second row, succession activation procedures. Sections 805 through 808 codify a sophisticated three-tier succession structure, but there's no implementation playbook. Liberty University's role in Tier 2 is established in policy, but we have no documented procedures for how Liberty would actually be contacted, what timeline applies, how nominees will be solicited or evaluated. Third row, IP management implementation. Article 7 establishes a licensing framework preventing unintended intellectual property aggregation, but operational procedures are completely undefined. There's no approval workflow for license agreements. There's no ongoing compliance monitoring protocol. There are no succession transfer procedures for what happens to licensed ministry content and trademarks during leadership transition. This evidence comes from comparative analysis, bylaws provisions on one side, operational documentation inventory on the other. The gap is not assumed, it's documented. This is what Kettner's framework calls identifying normative needs through systematic analysis against standards. The IRS standard is demonstrable accountability. The planning theory standard is operational implementation. The organizational reality is policy without protocols. Kettner's planning theory framework emphasizes that problem analysis must identify who experiences the problem and how different stakeholders are affected differently. Let me walk through the 5 stakeholder groups impacted by this implementation gap. First, the sole director, the chief pastor and president, experiences decision hesitation. Without documented protocols, every decision requires meta deliberation. Should I act on this unilaterally or do I need to consult the oversight committee? If consultation is required, what's the process? Is this committee review, committee approval, or simply committee awareness? Second, the oversight committee members experience role ambiguity. The bylaws establish their existence and qualification criteria, but operational protocols defining their scope of oversight are absent. They don't know how often should we meet, what requires our approval versus our awareness. How do we report findings? When do we intervene versus simply observe? Third, ministry officers, the secretary and treasurer, face implementation uncertainty. As execution signatories, they need protocols for implementing sole directed decisions and committee directives, particularly regarding financial transactions, contractual obligations, and intellectual property licensing under Article 7. Fourth, institutional partners, Liberty University and the future endowment trustee experience engagement confusion. Liberty's nomination role in Tier 2 succession is established in bylaws, but activation triggers and communication protocols are undefined. When does Liberty get contacted? Who contacts them?
What's the timeline?
How are nominees evaluated? Fifth, and most critically, the organization itself faces regulatory risk. The IRS requires demonstration, not just assertion, that governance structures prevent private benefit and ensure accountability. Without operational protocols, we cannot show HOW oversight functions, only that oversight provisions exist in policy. Each stakeholder group experiences this gap differently, but all suffer from the same root cause: policy without implementation protocols. The proposed intervention involves developing 5 operational deliverables that operationalize the governance structures already established in version 5 bylaws. Let me be very clear about what this intervention is and what it is not. This intervention is implementing existing governance provisions through documented operational protocols. This intervention is not redesigning governance or creating new governance structures. The 5 deliverables are: first, an oversight committee procedures manual. This will document meeting frequency, quorum requirements, decision-making processes, reporting protocols, and consultation triggers with the sole director. The manual translates Article 8 provisions into step-by-step operational procedures. Second, a decision authority matrix. This clarifies boundaries between sole director unilateral authority and oversight committee review requirements, with financial thresholds and subject matter categories specified. It answers the question, who decides what and under what conditions? Third, a succession implementation playbook. This provides step-by-step activation procedures for all 3 succession tiers: normal succession through committee vote, institutional nomination failsafe involving Liberty University and the endowment trustee, and emergency reconstitution through the governance review panel. It operationalizes sections 805 through 808. Fourth, IP management procedures. This implements the Article 7 licensing framework with approval workflow, ongoing compliance monitoring, and succession scenario protocols for ministry content and trademark licensing involving the Whiteside Family Trust. Fifth, online member advisory representative engagement guidelines. This will be developed for future implementation, defining how advisory input is solicited, documented, and incorporated while respecting the non-voting advisory-only limitations in Section 8. Notice the pattern. Every deliverable operationalizes an existing bylaw provision. Nothing is being invented. Everything is being implemented This is what planning theory calls translating policy into sustainable practice. Kettner's planning theory framework emphasizes that needs assessment must include quantifiable indicators where possible to establish baseline conditions and intervention targets. Let me show you how we're measuring implementation success. Four baseline metrics: establish current state and define target outcomes. First metric: oversight committee operational protocols. Current state: zero documented protocols exist. Target state: a complete procedures manual documenting meeting frequency, quorum requirements, decision authorities, reporting protocols, and sole director consultation triggers. Second metric: decision authority boundaries. Current state: the bylaws establish governance structure, but operational boundaries between sole director unilateral authority and oversight committee consultation requirements are undefined. Target state: a documented decision authority matrix specifying which decision categories require committee review, with financial thresholds and subject matter categories clearly delineated. Third metric: succession protocol activation procedures. Current state: the three-tier succession structure is codified in sections 8, oh 05 through 8, oh 08, but activation protocols are not operationalized. Liberty University's nomination role is established. The endowment trustee position awaits commission, but zero documentation exists for how institutional nominees are solicited, evaluated, or selected under the Tier 2 failsafe. Target state: a step-by-step succession implementation playbook for all three tiers, including institutional communication protocols, timeline triggers, and nominee evaluation criteria. Fourth metric: intellectual property management protocols. Current state: Article 7 establishes IP ownership principles and licensing requirements, but provides zero operational guidance for license agreement approval workflow, ongoing compliance monitoring, or succession scenario management. Target state: complete IP management procedures documenting the license approval process, monitoring protocols, and succession transfer procedures implementing the Article 7 framework. These metrics create the assessment framework for Chapter 4 of the dissertation. We'll measure protocol development completion and stakeholder role clarity improvement. This is how we'll know the intervention succeeded. It's essential to ground this intervention not just in planning theory and organizational literature, but in biblical and theological foundations. The version 5. Five bylaws include a stewardship foundation, preamble citing multiple scriptures as governance principles. These include Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, establishing that all organizational resources are ultimately God's, not ours. Luke 16:10-11 teaches faithful stewardship. Those faithful in little will be faithful in much. John 10:11 describes the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep, modeling servant leadership. Proverbs 13:22 speaks to generational stewardship and leaving an inheritance. But the verse most directly applicable to this implementation project is 1 Corinthians 14:40. Let all things be done decently and in order. Paul's directive that all things be done decently and in order supports governance implementation through documented procedures rather than informal practice alone. Decently and in order requires operational protocols that specify how governance functions, not just that governance exists. Additionally, 1 Corinthians 4:2 establishes that stewards must be found faithful. Authority carries accountability obligations requiring operational documentation. Proverbs 11:14 teaches that in the multitude of counselors there is safety, directly supporting the oversight committee structure and necessitating operational protocols that enable effective counsel. Theologically, stewardship theory from David Sherman and Donaldson's work provides grounding for understanding governance in ministry context. Unlike agency theory, which assumes self-interested behavior, stewardship theory recognizes that leaders in faith-based organizations often prioritize organizational mission over personal gain. However, and this is critical, even steward-oriented leaders benefit from structural accountability through operational protocols that protect both the organization and the leader. The proposed intervention operationalizes the oversight committee provisions already established in version 5, 5 bylaws, ensuring that biblically grounded governance principles function in documented sustainable practice. This isn't about distrusting leaders. It's about creating structures that enable faithful stewardship across leadership transitions and succession scenarios. Narration script to CLED 11. Kettner's framework emphasizes that intervention design must emerge from systematic problem analysis. Let me give you 5 compelling reasons why this governance implementation intervention is both necessary and appropriate. First reason, the implementation gap is authentic and consequential. This isn't a theoretical problem or an assumed need. The policy practice gap is documented through bylaw analysis and operational assessment. It creates measurable stakeholder ambiguity, prevents IRS accountability demonstration, and creates succession vulnerability. Real organizational consequences exist. Second reason, the organization demonstrates structural readiness. Governance frameworks already exist in version 5. 5 bylaws, eliminating the need for policy design. The intervention focuses purely on operationalizing existing provisions. Liberty University's institutional role is established. The endowment trustee position awaits commission. Full access to governance documents and implementation authority enables comprehensive protocol development. The organization is ready, it just needs implementation. Third reason, existing theory provides implementation guidance. Planning theory from Kettner provides systematic methodology for translating policy into practice. Stewardship theory from Davis and colleagues grounds the theological dimension. Organizational systems theory from Singay explains how structures interact with processes. Digital ecclesiology from Campbell addresses the unique dynamics of online faith communities. We're not inventing frameworks, we're applying established knowledge. Fourth reason, this intervention addresses an application gap, not a research gap. Governance implementation principles are well established in planning and nonprofit literature. The challenge is applying this knowledge to operationalize sophisticated bylaw provisions in a specific organizational context, a single member digital native faith organization. This makes it an appropriate dissertation in praxis, focus on practical application rather than theory generation. Fifth reason, the project scope is feasible and measurable. The intervention produces 5 specific deliverables: manuals, matrices, playbooks, procedures, and guidelines. We have 4 measurable outcomes tracking protocol completion and stakeholder clarity. This bounded scope enables rigorous assessment within dissertation constraints while addressing authentic organizational need. It's ambitious, but achievable. These 5 reasons establish compelling rationale for this intervention. It's needed, it's ready, it's grounded, it's appropriate, and it's feasible. Minus one less problem. Narration, scripticaz and TLMI. This intervention contributes at 2 levels: organizational effectiveness and scholarly knowledge. First, organizational contribution. This project translates sophisticated governance policy into sustainable operational practice, version 5. 5 bylaws provide the structural foundation. This dissertation in praxis develops the operational protocols that make those structures function in practice. The result is reduced stakeholder ambiguity, enabled IRS compliance demonstration, and created succession capability. The organization becomes more effective because governance actually works rather than just existing on paper. Second, scholarly contribution. This project advances understanding of governance implementation in single member digital native faith communities, an organizational form that is understudied in existing literature. Most nonprofit governance research assumes traditional board structures with multiple independent directors. Most ecclesiology research assumes physical congregations with geographic boundaries. This project sits at the intersection. How do you implement governance in an online church organized as a single member corporation? The contribution is a new theory. That's not what dissertation and praxis projects do. The contribution is demonstrated application of planning theory methodology to a specific organizational context, producing generalizable insights about policy to practice translation in unique governance structures. Both contributions matter. The organization gets functional governance. The Academy gets documentation of implementation methodology in an understudied context. Pause. Narration, scripted minus. Slide 13. Let me summarize what Chapter 1 establishes. We've identified a strategic problem, the misalignment between sophisticated governance policy in version 5, 5 bylaws, and the absence of operational implementation protocols. This isn't about governance design. That's done. It's about governance operationalization, translating policy into practice. We've documented current need through systematic evidence analysis. The implementation gap creates stakeholder ambiguity, prevents IRS compliance demonstration, and creates succession vulnerability. This is a felt need recognized by stakeholders and a normative need identified through systematic analysis against standards. We proposed a specific intervention, 5 operational deliverables that operationalize existing bylaw provisions rather than redesigning governance. Oversight Committee Procedures Manual, Decision Authority Matrix, Succession Implementation Playbook, IP Management Procedures, and Online Member Advisory Engagement Guidelines. Each deliverable addresses a documented gap. We've established theoretical and theological foundation. Planning theory from Kedner provides systematic implementation methodology. Stewardship theory grounds the faith dimension. Organizational systems theory explains structural interactions. Digital ecclesiology addresses online community dynamics. Biblical scriptures from the bylaw preamble establish the mandate for documented orderly governance. We've created an assessment framework for baseline metrics tracking protocol completion and stakeholder clarity improvement. This enables rigorous Chapter 4 evaluation. Now, Chapter 1 lays the foundation. Chapter 2 will develop the literature review exploring planning theory, stewardship theory, organizational systems theory, and digital ecclesiology in depth. Chapter 3 will describe implementation methodology. Chapters 4 and 5 will document protocol development and assess intervention effectiveness. This dissertation-in-praxis contributes both to organizational effectiveness at Anointed Connect Church and to scholarly understanding of governance implementation in single-member digital native faith communities. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions.